So why are so many Washington state school districts here, about approximately 10% of them, getting into serious financial trouble right now, and even more seem close to this financial abyss? Well, this is happening even though our state school funding numbers have increased substantially over the past 10 years, and despite the massive influx of federal cash and COVID kind of pass-through funds that have been just dumped everywhere. So what's actually going on here? Is it just Bidenomics and inflation? Well, I'm sure that that's part of it, but that certainly isn't the whole story. This very predictable result was inevitable, unfortunately, and it didn't just happen. It actually took years of work to lay the foundation for this fiasco, and while those responsible for this problem are kind of scrambling to shift the blame to others, of course, it is worth reviewing some of the decisions that have kind of put us in this situation. Now, before we look into Washington State's most screwed up school districts, don't forget to like and to share this video and hit the subscribe button down below. Roughly 60% of the people watching this video, probably you haven't taken the time to hit subscribe. So it costs you nothing but just a few seconds of your time to do so. Just hit it down below, but it does help our visibility on this channel, which I'm sure you will appreciate and our political and bureaucrat class will hate. So please annoy the politicians and bureaucrats and hit subscribe to our channel. So now back to the financially failing school districts in Washington State. Now the story is just starting to get more attention because the Marysville School District, for example, located just north of Everett in Snohomish County, is entering into an unprecedented process where OSPI, which stands for the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, has formally ruled now that the school district is financially insolvent and that the state's going to assign an oversight committee in just this last-ditch effort to get the school district back into some level of financial stability. Now, why is this significant and why Marysville? Well, this is significant because under the public school funding system adopted by the state of Washington, technically, all school districts are completely funded by the state in advance through the collection of property taxes that are distributed by the state to each district. So state collects it and they distribute it to each district based mostly on this formula on a per attending student basis. So the more kids attending, the more money that the school actually receives from the state. Now it's actually a little bit more complicated, and there's a few more complicated aspects of this, kind of the whole formula, but at its simplest level, this is essentially the primary way that the state's 295 school districts actually get funded. Now, in addition to the state funding formula, local districts, of course, are allowed to run school levies, which is essentially just a local voter-approved property tax increase, which adds additional local funding to a school district's budget. Now, in theory, this is used to pay for extras like extracurricular programs or additional technology, maybe more staffing, etc. Now, on top of that, local districts often pass additional bonds, which are essentially property taxes as well, but they require a larger percentage of voters to approve them, 60%, in order to have this like 25-year bonded debt that is used typically to pay for capital improvements like new school buildings, for example. Now, Washington State spends approximately $18,175 per student in the public school system today. Now, this compares to an average number of about $14,800, like $840 per student across the country. That's the average. Some states spend more and many spend a lot less. Now, Washington State's education budget has increased dramatically over the past 10 years, and this is the largest line item in Washington State's budget, accounting for basically over half of the taxpayer cash that's squandered by the state every year. Now, I say squandered specifically because the state is failing in its paramount duty to educate the children of the state based on any objective review of proficiency standards for the students, and the collapsing test scores just seem to mirror the increasing funds that are spent in public education. The more money spent, the worse the test scores become. But now back to Marysville and the other school districts that are facing financial oblivion today. How exactly did we get here? I mean, listen, people have been complaining about failing public school systems in our state for many years now. It's no secret. On one hand, people complain about the collapsing test scores. Employers complain about unprepared employees, basically, students out of college. Colleges complain about the need to increase their remedial classes to help repair the education deficit that the incoming high school graduates bring with them to college. They can't read, they can't write, they can't understand math at basic proficiency levels. And then parents, of course, complain about the schools failing their kids. And teachers complain about the declining discipline problems. And the whole educational industrial complex, it just wants more cash. It's always about more money. Now, this has actually been going on, unfortunately, for quite some time now. But what has happened recently to kind of throw gasoline on the bonfire of public education lately and I think that it's really the COVID pandemic lockdown policy, the whole response. Now, these governmental policies and the ripple effect that they had, they simply accelerated the problem so that we've actually arrived at this inevitable destination much quicker than expected, which makes it just a bit more dramatic for us all to witness today. And let's talk about the state's COVID lockdown policies. First, the sheer stupidity and incompetence that was displayed by local governments, including very specifically Chris Reykdal's just insane and bizarre attacks on school districts, and specifically teachers who didn't want to abandon their students to Zoom programs, pretty much that disrupted hundreds of thousands of kids in their already low expectation education path. And then many of them, really to this day, have yet to recover in this already very low standards that they were expected to meet. Now, you compound this with just the massive cash pile that was just tossed onto the school districts all around the state with no accountability, no auditing, and pretty much most of the districts, of course, spent this one-time cash windfall on what was actually recurring expenses, or even they increased their recurring expenses by hiring more people or giving pay raises. And now that the money has actually been spent and it's not being replaced, very few of these districts are willing to cut the programs that they just expanded, of course. Now, in addition, the COVID lockdown Zoom schools exposed just a massive number of parents who probably just didn't know before that they were exposed them to some of the very deficient education that was being provided to their kids. And this caused somewhere, at least in our state, somewhere around 41,000 families to remove their kids from the public school system entirely and either homeschool them or put them into private schools of some kind. Now, this in turn reduces the amount of money that specific school districts are going to receive from the state. And to make it even worse, Washington State's Democratic majority in the state legislature, with cheerleading, of course, from OSPI guy Chris Reykdal himself, they decided to double down on crazy and then implement weird political indoctrination programs using DEI, Marxist, and other pet agendas on the school districts rather than actually help the kids learn math or basic life skills like reading or writing. I mean, after all, it is obviously more important to make sure they can put condoms on cucumbers, indoctrinate them to divide and judge people by race, and to understand their pronoun selection choices than it ever would be to learn anything important like math. This also helped drive serious students out of the public school system just by itself. Now, on top of these self-inflicted wounds that, of course, were cheered at every step of the way by Reykdal, Governor Inslee, A.G. Ferguson, and then the other clowns who unfortunately run state government today, the state also decided to make teachers' lives more difficult by eliminating almost every disciplinary structure in existence, claiming it was racist, of course, and especially if you were going to have high expectations. So nobody fails, no student can be kicked out, and there are no consequences no matter what they do, and everyone's a winner. Now, then, of course, to make sure that the kids still pass and pretend those graduation numbers are up there, major effort was placed on just dumbing down almost every category of real learning. You modify the metrics, you reduce the goals, you lower expectations, you fudge the numbers, and it's way easier than actually fixing the problems. And then we can all pretend that the problems just don't exist. Now, it should be no surprise that close to 10% of the school districts in Washington state are facing this financial cliff, even though it was very predictable. They could have avoided it. Some districts, like the Moses Lake School District, they pretended they had an $11 million accounting error. But these specific stories just mask the sheer incompetence that has become increasingly common in so many of these districts across the state. And remember, we actually covered this story about how the previous superintendent of the Moses Lake School District was actually caught stealing money from the school, and the school board still gave him a bonus as he was fired, and then simply moved into just another nearby school district to just plague them instead. Now, finally, to compound the problem, the Washington Education Association, which is a teachers' union for the state, they have become just hyper-partisan, far more than before, and just excessively political, and their math-denying political agenda has been focused on radically increasing the cost of education by inflating the number of union members that they actually have. And they do this by reducing as much accountability as possible and then ignoring the collapsing education results, all in an effort to promote themselves. The kids are always an afterthought and a photo op at best, but certainly not important to the union's cash collection program. The Marysville School District they had one of the highest compensated school administrations and teacher staff salaries in the state now for over 10 years, and no matter how much they deny the reality of math, inevitably, there are consequences in the end, and they're paying those consequences today. Now, Chris Reykdal, for years, ignored the very obvious problems in the Marysville School District. This was not a secret. He knew it. But he ignored them until he suddenly found himself in a competitive election this year. So conveniently, he suddenly wakes up from his slumber. And of course, as always, he's been cheering the DEI kind of self-hate agenda, celebrating newly discovered pronouns, super important, pretending that collapsing test scores are not his fault. I think the Seattle Times said he was high-fiving kids in the slow lane. And then, he's been pushing this Marxist theory every day. But now, in just a brand new direction, right now, pretending that he suddenly rediscovers the reality of math, and he actually cares now about a school district that has been willfully and just maliciously destroying their economic future for years with just inflated costs, and now they're financially failing. Now he suddenly cares. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm sure that he does care about his reelection, but he doesn't care about the many failing school districts in the state or the students that they're clearly failing. This has happened on his watch. The fixes here are not easy, not because we can't figure out the policies, but because the special interests involved in the education industrial complex, they don't want the gravy train to end. They will all be spouting off about needing more money, of course, because it's always about the cash piles, but they waste whatever additional funds they get, just as they have recently. So what can be done? Well, first, there is a desperate need to revamp and restore the primary education system, much closer to a no-excuses model of education where basic skills are emphasized and school discipline is restored. Not every student is a winner. They aren't. And they can't all graduate on time. But you can fix the system pretty quickly to ensure that those who are failing get the attention that they need, and they don't distract the rest of the students, and the diploma that they receive actually means something when they finally earn it. Teachers don't need smaller classrooms when classroom discipline is restored, and there are real consequences for disruptions in the classroom. This can actually make the education process substantially more efficient. I'll point out that roughly 88% of the annual school budget in a given school district is typically related to staffing costs. But bloated administrations and administrative salaries are also part of the problem and the cost drivers here. Now, secondly, the teachers who opt out of the scam of the WA union membership, they can actually give themselves, on average, a $1,000 pay raise just by holding on to their union dues for themselves instead of wasting it on the WA. The hyper-partisan political machinations of the self-serving union, it really helps nobody but their own very selfish agenda. And the kids and the teachers are just the photo op props to help a parasitic organization that doesn't care whose lives they destroy along the way. Now, finally, we do need somebody who's serious in the office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, and it certainly isn't Chris Reykdal. I mean, he sold his soul long ago, and every child that gets left behind on his watch, every one of them does. Now, public education isn't going to go away in Washington State, even if it goes bankrupt tomorrow, because they'll just shift into kind of this increasingly lower and lower quality product, and no matter how much taxpayer cash gets shoveled their way. Now, by the way, it's worth noting that there are currently school districts where those schools are not in financial distress. Maybe somebody should start paying attention to the choices that their school boards are making to avoid the math illiterate events currently being experienced by the other districts. Well, not every district will face the exact same challenges. There are clearly policy choices that can be emulated and imitated from the districts not going into the fiscal black holes. Until then, more school districts will financially fail. They will. And they have nobody to blame but themselves and their poor choices in the recent past. They have understandably caused the parents and the taxpayers in those districts to lose faith in them, and who blames them for pulling their kids out? And until these districts are willing to realize their own actions and policies have very clearly contributed to this lack of faith, they're not going to be able to restore the public's trust. Now, if you live in one of the school districts that are not failing, like the Marysville School District, you should start paying attention to the decisions your board is actually making to avoid these financial failures. Now is actually the time to engage and fix the problems and provide your suggestions on how they can get things under control or stay under control. Some school board members have been fighting to restore sanity and fiscal accountability in their school districts. Just a hint here, These are always the school board members who are hated and attacked by the WA and the Democratic Party. However, their willingness to get involved, to show up, there basically are consequences here. And these, in this case, it's actually good consequences, even if they haven't been able to make as much headway as they might have wanted. But if you want to fix what has been broken by our state legislature, people like Chris Reykdal, the WEA, you have to show up and engage. I mean, sometimes you do have to get on the school board or at least start studying what is happening in a school district near you. Even if your kids are long out of school or they're in private or homeschool, the kids coming out of the public school, these are our neighbors, our future coworkers, and our community members. We want to help them too, but we can't help anyone, and we can't help our community if we don't show up, because the future inevitably belongs to those who show up.